Ladies and gentlemen, what the evidence is going to show in this case is that on the night of September 21st, 2009, this defendant, Mr. Ward, pointed a gun in the direction of his wife's face at about a distance of 12 to 18 inches, and he pulled the 12-pound trigger on a .357 Magnum, and it went off. And it struck her basically right between the eyes in her left nostril, and as Dr. Stephanie, the medical examiner, will tell you, essentially was a straight-on trajectory. Front to back, slightly right to left towards her left ear, and slightly downward going upward. After he did that, after that bright flash of that gun went off in their bedroom around 7:50 p.m., after that loud bang that maybe gave him ringing in his ears and the smell of gunpowder, she drops from her right to her left. You will see the blood pattern that was created by this gunshot. Blood was projected from the pressure in her head, the blood pressure, onto the comforter in the bed a couple feet in front of her. There was also a dripping event as she fell from left to right, and then a projecting event onto the wall as she was going down. And then as she lay there, now creating a pool of blood, Mr. Ward didn't do CPR. He didn't tap her on the shoulder. He didn't do anything other than take the .357 Magnum, open up the nightstand drawer, put the .357 Magnum in the nightstand drawer, close it, and then take his BlackBerry and call 911. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But how did the Wards get to this point in their life where this happens? Well, for some time they had been under some financial pressure. In his business, which back then was real estate development, not unlike other people, real estate development went really south, and his businesses went into business bankruptcy. The first stage of that is called reorganization. That happened in 2008. And then in 2009, when it seemed inevitable that that wasn't going to save everything, it goes into this liquidation process. And when it goes into this liquidation process, that means basically somebody, a trustee, is going to get appointed by the bankruptcy court to come in and now be the new pretend owner of these businesses, and then sell what you can to pay what debts you can pay off. So that started occurring in 2009. And then there was a civil suit filed against both Mr. and Mrs. Ward on September 1st of 2009 by this Bond Safeguard Insurance Company. Very long and necessary story, but the short of it is that was putting pressure on Mr. and Mrs. Ward as well. And on Friday, September 18th, before this shooting on Monday, September 21st, there was an after 5 p.m. phone conference between Mr. Ward, Mrs. Ward, their respective attorneys, the trustee to this bankruptcy, the new quote-unquote owner of the business, and the trustee's attorney. Because Mr. and Mrs. Ward were set up for what we in criminal would call a deposition. That's a term you're probably more familiar with. In bankruptcy, it's called a 2004 examination. That was set to occur on Thursday, September 24th. And the bankruptcy attorney was adamant and set on Mrs. Ward going first before Mr. Ward, and that it would occur on the 24th as they had agreed to. Now, there was no subpoena, no court order. It was just an agreement, and the Wards expressed, and their attorneys expressed, no, we're not doing it. She's not going first, and she's going to a horse show that day. We need to reschedule this. And that's kind of where it was left off, was we ain't coming, and the bankruptcy people saying, yes, you are, and, we'll see you in court. We'll fight about it sometime earlier next week. And then that is the pressure. And you're going to hear, ultimately, I believe, from some family members and some friends of the Wards, and they're going to know a variety of different levels of what's going on. Some people are not going to know very much about this financial trouble. Some people are going to know more. Some people are going to know a little bit more about Mr. and Mrs. Ward's drinking and medications, and some people are going to know a little bit less. You're going to hear a spectrum of knowledge from about 6 people. And we'll get to those people when they come. So, well, what happened on this particular night? I mean, there's logs being thrown on this fire. The financial stuff, a lawsuit, this bond safeguard company's harassing them up in Atlanta. They have a different home up there, photographing Mrs. Ward every day, just being nasty to them. So on this particular evening, what do we know? Well, we do know that there's a bottle of wine on the counter, and by all accounts, everybody's going to say Mrs. Ward liked her red wine. I think one of her daughters might even tell you she's a loud, crazy Italian woman, and she liked her red wine. And Mr. Ward liked to drink a little scotch, and so they were out there drinking. You will even hear that from Mr. Ward's words himself, that he had had a couple of drinks out on that porch, but he wasn't drinking wine. So they're drinking. That much we know, because that's what Mr. Ward says. There's an empty bottle of wine on the counter, some bottles in the trash. No idea how much of that was consumed or not, except that there's a 3/4 empty bottle on the counter. What else do we know about the scene? Well, you're going to see that this is a nice house. It's very big. It's got several porches. It's got a lot of different rooms, bedrooms, 2 sets of stairs, even an elevator if you don't want to use one of the 2 sets of stairs. Out on the patio, one of the patios, you're going to see that there's a broken glass, a wine glass, the base of which is in one area kind of between 2 chairs where 2 people might have been sitting, with a cigar ashtray between them, and with a cigar that had been lit just sitting in a chair, not in the ashtray, just sitting in the chair. And you will see that there was spilled red wine in the other part of this wine glass, a few feet away in front of this grill. And red wine spilled all over the tile, the grout, left there, not cleaned up. So we know that. And you're going to see pictures of Mr. Ward later in the evening. And on the back right lower quadrant, for lack of a better term, quarter of his shirt is something that looks a lot like wine. And it's on the back of his, top of his shorts as well. And when he gets his ankles swabbed later, ultimately looking for blood, this same purple burgundy substance is on the inside of one of his ankles. Upstairs, in the master bedroom, there will be this same, yet different than blood looking pattern. And you will see, even 9 years later now, when you open up some of these packages and look at bed sheets and whatnot, there's no mistaking these 2 things. I would submit that what was the wine looks a little yellowish brownish these days, and the pictures are a better indicator of what it looked like that day. So it's this pink, purple burgundy-ish stain on his bed, and it's apparently his side of the bed. That's what the testimony is going to be. That's what his statement ultimately is. And the pattern matches the back of his shirt, even though Mr. Ward ultimately says he didn't sit on the bed. What he says happened is, about a week earlier, his wife was playing some game on the computer and spilled some wine in their bed. And I submit once you see the photographs, you can make up your own mind about that with the pattern. And when you see the immaculate condition of this house, whether or not that would be an acceptable thing to be on the bed for a week. That'll be your decision. So, what can we surmise from that? I would submit that that shows that there's an argument. Over what? Who knows? Could it have been the money? Sure. Could it have been dinner? Sure. Could it have been what was on Fox News on the television that was left on downstairs? Sure. But there's some sort of disagreement. Now, there's going to be a variety of different disciplines of expert testimony that comes in during this trial. And one of the first people that is going to, one of the first topics I submit we'll probably hear about is the investigation by the sheriff's office. And let's start walking through some of that. Mr. Ward, 911. That's how this begins. And it begins with him saying, "I just shot my wife." He says that 5 times. 5 times. I just shot my wife. He also says she's dead, she's gone, with certainty. He's on the 911 call. And then the operator asks him, and I submit when you hear the context, it's a fair question, "Did you do this on purpose?" It's like, "No, it was an accident. I don't know what happened. Just send somebody." And so he goes out into the driveway and he meets law enforcement. Now you're going to hear law enforcement, 3 people show up with guns, because the call came out that he just shot his wife. So 3 deputies come with guns, And they're going to say he wasn't very responsive to their commands, appeared to be impaired to some regard, some degree. Ultimately, he does listen to their commands. The BlackBerry that he makes the phone call with gets put onto the driveway. Ultimately, what they were afraid was a weapon in his hands with just some reading glasses. So there was a lot of commands shouting, get on the ground because of stuff in his hands. Fair enough. So from there, he's put into a car and then ultimately brought over to the sheriff's office. At the sheriff's office, and I submit it's a fair point that one of the defense witnesses will probably raise, Pascal Diaz, he's an ex-Miami cop, very experienced guy. Fair point that he'll raise is, why are you letting this guy have his BlackBerry? Why aren't you securing it, make sure it doesn't get deleted? Fair enough point. But what does happen with this BlackBerry is an email gets sent out to some attorneys. Mr. Ward's attorney, Mrs. Ward's attorney, the trustee of the bankruptcy, and the attorney for the trustee of the bankruptcy. And that email says, subject matter, you bastards, content, Diane just killed herself tonight. Hope you're happy. Bob Ward. So there's a second version. And ultimately, they take swabs from his hands to test for GSR. They ultimately take photographs of him. And then at a later date, ultimately, they get some DNA samples, which is done with a large Q-tip, which will be explained to you, scraped inside your mouth, hurts a little bit like a flu test, and then off it goes to the lab. Now, some other criticism will be, well, why didn't you photograph him right there on the scene? Fair enough. It was 2009. Patrol comes out first, and then at some point, once they clear the scene and make sure it's safe, then these people called CSIs, like on television, come out. They're the ones with the cameras. Now, in 2018, if something like this were to occur today, obviously there'd be body cameras, and it's a different world. So, fair enough criticism. There's no photographs of Mr. Ward right there in the darkness of his driveway. They're taken later. And nor is he swabbed for GSR right there at the scene. It's a couple hours later down at the station when the CSI has an opportunity to do it. Fair enough criticism. So that's basically the investigation as far as it goes with Mr. Ward there. And then it turns to, what does the scene tell us? What does the blood pattern tell us? What does the gunshot pattern, and we'll discuss that as well, on her face tell us? So now we get into these different disciplines. So the blood pattern, what is the blood pattern going to tell us? Well, like I said earlier, the blood pattern is going to tell us that after she is shot, she projects blood from what the expert will call cranial pressure, inherent pressure. It's a pressurized system. Everybody knows how that works. You get the cuff on your arm every year. That projects some smaller particles, medium-sized particles of blood onto the comforter. And unfortunately, because of the fabric of the comforter, experts aren't going to be able to measure it and say, oh, this is so many millimeters. Oh, there's a tadpole tail that shows it went in this direction. It's very limited what they can say other than it was clearly projected, as opposed to this dripping pattern, which gets onto Mr. Ward's right shoe, gets onto the inside of her. It gets all over her ultimately. So there's these two patterns. And after she projects, and that is onto a bed that is 27 inches high, and the folded over comforter, it kind of looks like when you at a nice hotel and you come down in this turn down service, it looks like that paper airplane, two triangles on each side of the bed. And so it's folded over. So that's a few inches higher, but there's blood projected on there. And then behind a couple of feet, there's some projection that's caused by the beating of the heart. Their expert won't say arterial because the medical examiner didn't list every single blood vessel that was damaged, but it's essentially arterial spurting caused by blood. That's about 3 feet high and a couple feet behind her. What our expert's going to be able to tell you is that's projected from her. She's the only source of blood. There's no other injuries on her other than that injury. There's no injuries on Mr. Ward. In fact, there's no signs of a struggle whatsoever in this room as far as furniture being turned over, lampshades, that sort of stuff. Then as she falls onto the left, she splashes a little bit, and then it continues to splash. And you can see there are some satellite patterns, they call them, with the little tadpole tails that can show you directionality. And on the wall, there's going to be some of those little satellite patterns with directionality that they can say that was from the spattering on the wall. And Mr. Ward doesn't have any blood on his hands. He doesn't have any blood on his arms. The firearm does not have any blood on it. It does not have any blood in the barrel. Yet we know for sure, with great certainty, that the firearm was pointed at Mrs. Ward. Okay? And we'll get to those facts later on. So that's what the blood pattern shows. And also, where it actually is on him, besides his shoes, is there's a projected pattern on the right leg of his shorts. Not on his left side, just on the right side. And we'll get to that during the testimony. So that's what the blood pattern's going to show. Even though this is a .357 Magnum, which will be described as a high-caliber firearm, and those of you familiar with .357s know you can put .38 caliber ammunition in it or a .357. This is with .357 ammunition, the taller cartridge with more gunpowder, which makes these things go faster. And the faster these things go, these bullets, the more of a bloodshed event you expect with blowback. And we'll talk about that later. But remarkably, there was no exit wound. It did go through the back of her skull, but it stayed within her scalp. And so that made it more difficult for the blood pattern people to be able to say much again, because without an exit wound and without the projectile going into a piece of furniture or a wall or something, it makes it harder for them to go at where people were standing when this happened. But what we do have, I've already discussed the blood pattern. The other thing we'll talk about is gunshot patterns, okay? Now, especially with a .357 Magnum like this gun, which is called a short barrel, it's 1.75 inches. It's not even 2. They might call it a 2, but it's 1.75 inches. Not all that gunpowder the manufacturer packs into this big cartridge gets burnt. And so it goes into your face or wherever you're shooting if you do it close enough. And the range for that is kind of contact up to a couple feet away, maybe a meter. But Mrs. Ward has this stuff called stippling on her face. And that is the gunpowder that struck her face. And they once used to think it was burns, because it is hot, but it gets rapidly cooled by the air as it's going through the air. But it's like abrasions. It's little scrapes. And it forms this thing called a stippling pattern. And so people examine the diameter as best they can. And unfortunately, the diameter of the pattern was a little wider than her face. But height-wise, they could say it was about 6 inches. So we're in the neighborhood of 6 by 6, like a 6-inch diameter. And ultimately what was done in this case was this firearm, the .357 Magnum, was used to test fire into some cloth at different distances. Now, mostly with store-bought ammunition, and we'll talk about that, but also 2 rounds out of the 5 that were originally in this revolver. It's a 5-shot revolver. And a revolver is one of those guns like Yosemite Sam on the cartoon had that spins. The cartridges don't get ejected onto the ground, so like when you run out of 5, you've got to hurry up and unload them if you're in a rush. So they test fired 2 of those rounds that were found in the gun, one at 12 inches, one at 18 inches. And then the store-bought ammunition or shelf of the FDLE, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, they did a few shots, 3 at 6, 12, 18, 24, and 30. And ultimately, I mean, there might be some minor disagreements between the people from the state and from the defense, but the consensus seems to be the best approximation is the 12 and 18-inch shots with the actual ammunition from the gun. Now, there's limitations on this. Obviously, the cloth is flat. Mrs. Ward's face is not flat. So there's some limitations to that, the depth from the tip of her nose to the sides of her ears, whatever it is, an inch or 2. No way to really replicate that. I submit that the evidence will show that cloth is an acceptable substitute for pig skin. Obviously, you don't use human skin for these tests. And even within the gun, even if all 5 of those rounds were in the same lot or batch of ammunition that was made in the factory, you can't guarantee from one shot to the next that it's going to be exactly the same. That's why you have to do multiples. But they were limited with how many rounds they could use with the actual gun because there's only 5 to start with. 1 was in Mrs. Ward, and 1 ultimately was test-fired in another situation, which we'll get to. So the gunshot patterns ultimately boils down to 12 to 18 inches seems to be the best approximation of range. Then we're going to have some other experts, the medical examiner. You're probably going to hear from more than one medical examiner in this case. Those are the people that are doctors. They have medical degrees, either an MD or a DO. I don't think any of the folks in this trial have a DO. So they're all MDs, medical doctors. And after that part of medical school where you have to decide where you're going with your life, they chose pathology, and they focused on this discipline called forensic pathology, which is what doing autopsies is, and pathology is taking blood tests, figuring out what the source of disease is, injury, so on and so forth. So there is some agreements between the experts. One of those agreements is she did not do this to herself. This is not a self-inflicted suicidal gunshot wound. Where they're going to have some disagreement is over whether or not this is a homicide, and homicide for a medical pathologist is a different term than what we use as murder. Homicide for a medical pathologist simply means that death at the hands of another. They're not making any opinions whether it was illegal, justified, whatever. It's just death at the hands of another. So Dr. Stephanie and the state's experts are going to say this is a homicide in their opinion, and they will tell you why they believe that. Angle of the wound, distance of the wound, Mrs. Ward is a female. There's all sorts of different things that they rely upon. And they consider all the different surrounding circumstances, including the scene, people's statements, whereas I believe the testimony, I submit the testimony from Dr. Anderson would be, he's more focused on just what does the body tell you? What does the science of the body tell you? And because the science of the gunshot stippling tells him that it was what they call intermediate range, still within the possibility that this was a struggle, he's going to say it's a struggle or a homicide, but he agrees it's not a suicide. And we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the different issues between the different doctors as they come through. Now, one of the other things that they do, in addition to doing the autopsy, obviously the cause of her death was the gunshot wound. That's what they call cause. It tore up all the brain tissue, horrible amount of bleeding, that caused her death. The manner is what we were just talking about, whether it's a homicide or a struggle. They also run some toxicology tests on people. When you go to Quest Labs for your physical, either before or after your annual physical, you get some blood work done. And so in her blood work, what we are going to know is that she was 0.11 when it comes to alcohol. And just for a frame of reference, in state of Florida, and I think in most states that want to get federal funding from the government, it's 0.08 is the cutoff for when you can drive or not and get a DUI. So she's above that 0.08 by almost 50%. Now you're going to hear a variety of things about her drinking. She does it often, she's been doing it a long time. You'll hear that from her physician. Mrs. Ward has always reported that she was a wine drinker, and it changes from visit to visit how much she's reporting. Family members are going to say that she's a drinker. Mr. Ward will say the family even jokes about, well, that was probably her normal blood alcohol level. She was a drinker. So obviously you can build tolerance to that, so you can use your common sense and take it with a grain of salt at the end of the case that was 0.11. She also had this medication called Citalopram. It's an antidepressant. If you're really interested, we'll have it explained. It's an SSRI, serotonin inhibitor, right? So it's an antidepressant. And an antidepressant actually works by kind of depressing you. It's called a central nervous system depressant. So it slows you down, makes you more sloth-like, less like Speedy Gonzales or the Tasmanian Devil. Her levels at the time of her death were 840 nanograms, which is really small. I think it goes milli, micro, nano, if I remember from science class, and they'll correct us. 840 nanograms per milliliter, which is 1/1000th of a liter, and you have somewhere in the neighborhood of like 5 liters of blood, I think, or maybe it's 4. So that's how they test it. The therapeutic range for that particular drug, where they want you to be at when you're alive, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 or 80 nanograms up to 200 nanograms. So we're at 4.5 times, approximately, the top of the therapeutic range. So there's a couple of different explanations for this that you're going to hear. One explanation is, Well, there's this thing called post-mortem redistribution. Post meaning after, mortem meaning death. Redistribution meaning redistribution. And so you'll hear that after death, there are some substances like citalopram, not like ethanol, but like citalopram, that come back out of the tissues and back into the bloodstream after death. And it's something that they've studied. They understand that this happens. So the second part of that is, where do you take one's blood from for a blood sample after they're dead? It's more likely to occur in the thorax, what they call, your chest cavity and your abdomen. It's less likely to be noticed, but not entirely, peripheral blood draws. And her peripheral blood draw was kind of in her bikini line of her left femur, top of your leg artery. So, at the end of the case, you will have to decide whether or not, based on the evidence, you think this is possibly post-mortem redistribution or not. So there's that possibility that it's not reflective of what her antemortem, before death level was. And you'll hear, well, how would one get to 840 nanograms? And you're going to hear that it's not one extra pill. You're not going to hear that it's 2 extra pills or 3. Keep going, and we'll hear. It's a bunch. And you're going to hear that, the peak serum value, like say you do quaff a bottle of pills, how long is it going to be before you start seeing that peak value in your blood? That's going to be a few hours. And so as we back up through her day and her timeline, you're going to hear that this had to have occurred a couple hours before this shooting at 7:50 p.m., and that's still based on the assumption that Mr. Ward called 911 right after the shooting. There's no way to know. It's entirely based on what he says. And there's no neighbors really close. These are big houses. These are big estates. So nobody else can say, oh yeah, I'm the neighbor and I heard the gunshot at X. That's not going to happen. So you're going to hear she was on the phone with some friends at 6:30. You're going to hear that she was on phone with her daughters earlier in the day. And so you're going to have to figure out and sort out, well, when is it, why is it she would have taken these amount of pills to get to that level? Now, put on the other hat. What if this truly was her before-death value? What does that mean for her behavior? Well, the experts are going to say, there's no way to predict what somebody's actual behavior, what any particular one person's behavior and reaction would be to citalopram at that level. And quite frankly, no way to predict what any one person's behavior would be at 0.11 ethanol, because everybody's different. You're going to hear that over and over again. Everybody's different. But you're going to hear what some of the side effects are of citalopram. You're going to hear, of course, that aggression, hostility, those sorts of things are listed as the side effects of citalopram. But what you will also hear is, again, as I stated earlier, it's a central nervous system depressant. So sleepiness, sluggishness, loss of gross motor skill control, loss of fine motor skill control, loss of ability to see clearly. All the things that you envision alcohol would do to you, which is another central nervous system depressant. And you're also going to hear that this stuff stacks. So antidepressant with alcohol stacks up. It doesn't counteract each other. It's not like doing a little cocaine after a night of drinking to kind of bounce yourself off with stimulants and depressants, all right? She's also on this medication called Trazadone. Now, that particular medication, you will hear from her doctor, was given to her as a sleep aid, even though it was originally thought up as an antidepressant by the drug manufacturers. She's below therapeutic values on that. Not likely she had taken it yet that day. But again, what little there is of that stacks on with the citalopram and the ethanol. So when you are asked at the end of the day to decide, well, if that was her living value of citalopram, 840 nanograms, well, what effect would it have had on her? You have the whole spectrum. And the only person that you can rely upon is Mr. Ward saying that his wife snuck up behind him with a gun, and we're going to get to that. That's the only thing that you can rely upon. So there's that. And that ties in with the toxicologists. The toxicologists are going to go into everything we just said about the citalopram, just like the medical examiners. You're also going to hear, perhaps, from psychologists. Psychologists are going to say people grieve differently. People's memories aren't like videotapes. They're more malleable to fit our life narrative. We'll hear about that when the time comes. I submit you're probably also going to hear from Mrs. Ward's physician. And what we're going to learn from the physician is Mrs. Ward was just an anxious, high-strung person. She will describe her as you could feel her anxiousness in the room when you were in the room with her. She was on the edge. Very edgy, high-strung person. A crazy loud Italian, like her daughter says. And so before Dr. West even met Mrs. Ward in 2005, which is when their patient-doctor relationship began, you're going to hear that Mrs. Ward was on an antidepressant as far back at least as 1998. So it's not like in 2009, this is her first week, first month, first couple months of being on an antidepressant. And that's important because you're going to hear that changes in dosages can have a various effect on you. And that's why you got to be careful when you're changing doses. And of course the argument will be, well, if she went up to as many pills as it would have taken to get her to 840, well, that's a change. But so you're going to hear she was on antidepressants at least as far back as 98. When Dr. West met her for the first time in 2005, there was no real sit down and discussion about why are you self-diagnosing yourself as OCD or anxious and depression and ruling out situational things as opposed to chemical imbalance in your brain, which necessitates medication. And she'll say that these days they prescribe a lot less of this medicine for whatever reason. But she immediately, Dr. West, on her first meeting with Mrs. Ward, changes her from Prozac. Mrs. Ward started with Zoloft to Prozac to this drug called Citalopram, brand name Celexa, right on the first visit. So from that, you're going to know it's not like this is her first day on Citalopram. It's year 4. Because it's the summer, summer of 2005, July, I think, when they first met. So that's 50 months now, in September 2009, that Mrs. Ward has been on this citalopram. And at one point, the dosage was increased up to 60 milligrams. So she took 3 of these little 20-milligram pills once a day altogether. So there's that. And nearly every time that she showed up at the doctor, she made her doctor aware that she was drinking, and she liked to drink. And so the doctor, even though these medicines say be careful, if not, don't drink on these medicines, still prescribed these medicines. She had no fear of the interaction between ethanol and these antidepressants because she was well aware of it when she's writing these scripts. So we'll hear about all that. But the bottom line is, you're not going to hear evidence that this was the first day of taking Celexa. This isn't the first day of drinking on Celexa. This is a thing. Now, you're also going to hear from time to time she was forgetful about her medications. She would sometimes forget to take her medications. But you're not going to hear she ever accidentally took as many extra pills as it would require her to get up to 840 nanograms. So that's the toxicologist. From there, let's talk about what Mr. Ward has said about this case. There's the 911 call. The 911 call simply starts off with, "I just shot my wife." He says that 5 times. In fact, he says, "She's gone, she's done. I'm sorry." That's what he says until the operator, after hearing all of this, says, "Is this on purpose?" He says, No, it was an accident. I don't know what happened." You're also going to hear that email that was sent just a couple hours later, where now Mrs. Ward committed suicide. Dramatically different from what he just said. And then afterwards, later on in 2011, he has an interview with Channel 13 and tells this reporter a lot of things. What Mr. Ward will say during that interview is, I fell asleep on the patio that evening. And when I woke up, no idea where my wife was. I have no idea how that wine glass got broken. I have no idea how that wine got on the ground. In fact, I have no idea how that wine got on the back of my shirt. When I went to the sheriff's office and I went to the restroom, I asked him, where did this come from? Where did this wine come from on the back of my shirt, in my shorts? And so Mr. Ward, after waking up alone, goes upstairs, and he's going to empty his pockets out onto his nightstand at the side of the bed. And what his statement is that his wife, like imagine a thriller movie with the camera panning back out, is all of a sudden right behind him. This close, he shows, holding a gun, pointing it at him. This 55-year-old woman on 0.11 of alcohol and supposedly at 4.5 times the therapeutic value of Citalopram snuck up on him and pointed a gun at him. Without making a sound and without a word, he turns around and, taking the gun from pointed at him, in an instant, in a struggle, turns the gun 180 degrees, and during the struggle, that is how the gun goes off 12 to 18 inches from her face and kills her. That's what he says. And at the conclusion of the case, I'm going to submit that everything he said, those 3 different stories, simply, you have to take that into account under the jury instructions. Now, you're also going to hear about what wasn't done. They didn't test the holster for DNA. Well, you're going to learn a lot more about DNA, some of you, than others, during this trial. DNA does not simply come off of you on everything you touch. Some people shed DNA more readily than others, kind of like some cats and some dogs mess up your couch more quickly than others. Depends on how long you touch something, how vigorously you touch something, and it can be transferred. If my wife's DNA is on my hand, I can end up transferring it somewhere else, those sorts of things. So, ultimately, obviously, Mr. and Mrs. Ward live together. So you have to, before you consider any particular one DNA result, you can't examine it in a vacuum. You have to consider all of the context surrounding it. So the holster ultimately was not tested for DNA. A lot of things were not tested for DNA and fingerprints in this case because the CSIs will tell you they live together. Their fingerprints and their DNA are probably going to be all over the house. It's not even just from touching, coughing, sneezing, projecting DNA. All right? But what we do know from the DNA is that in the fingerprints, they were unable to lift any fingerprints from the gun. Again, not everything you touch leaves a fingerprint, but back to the DNA. What we do know is it is Mrs. Ward's blood on his shorts and on his shoe. So independent of anything he says, we know he was standing right there during the projected blood event. What we also know is that the grip and the trigger of this gun show Mr. Ward's profile at every location they tested back in 2009. And way over the reporting requirement of what they call RFU units. You don't really need to know what RFU stands for, but they'll tell you anyways. But 100 is the cutoff before you can include somebody. And so these tests that they run produce these little mountains, or not so mountains. What you will see is that at every location they tested back then, Mr. Ward is very present. And at the 10-second injection, and they'll explain it far better than I can, but basically to do the DNA testing, you extract it from the sample, like the Q-tip or whatever it is, and you inject it for 10 seconds. When they did that at 10 seconds, there was no Mrs. Ward to be called at 100 units at all on the trigger and the grip of the gun. Now, I expect that there will be testimony about how that was an egregious error. You should have never mixed the grip and the trigger together to test to try and get a DNA profile. And I think what the evidence is going to show is it would be very difficult to pull the actual trigger without holding the grip. And the trigger has a far less sized surface area than the grip. And the trigger is far more smooth and less likely to create shedding events than the serrated grip, which is designed for you to hold onto the gun when it goes off and kicks back. With the same amount of force that it expels the bullet, it's kicking you back. So, you can make up for yourself at the end of the case whether separating the DNA from the trigger and the grip matters or not, but that's how they did it. The testimony is going to be that's how they always do it to test it. And so Mr. Ward is there at every location they test, very significantly. Now, like we say when we use guitars, you wish you could turn it up to 11, past that 10 on your volume dial. Well, they can do that in the DNA testing. They turned it up to 22 seconds. Now, when they turn it up to 22 seconds of injection, obviously, Mr. Ward's mountains get about 220% higher. And now, at a handful of locations, Mrs. Ward makes the cutoff requirement for 100. And in fact, somebody else is on there too at a couple locations. Because part of what you're going to learn is DNA can remain for a while until it gets cleaned, until it gets destroyed by heat, sunlight, bleach, chemicals, those sorts of things. So again, you got to take it into context. How this DNA got here and when, you have to look to surrounding circumstances, particularly in a domestic situation. So there will be that testimony about the DNA. So at the end of this case, after you hear everything about the Wards, you're going to hear a lot about Mrs. Ward and her drinking and her medications and the stress she was under. But you're also going to hear the same applied to Mr. Ward. He would drink too. He was prescribed these medications. He was anxious. All those same factors apply to them. At the end of the day, there's two people sitting in a boiler room being compressed with pressure, living in a house where there's firearms, drinking, medications. And you're going to hear, as I said earlier, Mr. Ward, when you hear the 911 call and when you hear from the officers who were trying to instruct him onto the ground, showed signs of impairment as well. When you mix all those things, it doesn't matter whether or not you're drinking a $59 bottle of wine, like Mrs. Ward, or a $5 bottle of wine. When you mix pressure, guns, alcohol, wine on somebody's back, that's a catalyst for something like this to happen. And I submit that at the close of this case, there's going to be proof beyond a reasonable doubt that it was Mr. Ward who had the gun in his hand first and who squeezed the trigger and shot and killed his wife out of anger. Thank you.